nVidia's desktop Turing and Ampere-based graphics cards cost an arm and a leg right now. By comparison, RTX 2000 and 3000 enabled laptops are both relatively common and reasonably priced. Or, well, not unreasonably priced. You can get one and keep both kidneys is what I'm saying. The previous entry-level option of the RTX series was the 2060 Max-Q, which, despite its place at the bottom of the product stack, looks pretty powerful compared to a lot of the older desktop GPUs I test on this channel. That being said, my 2022 test suite is full of demanding titles. nVidia developed DLSS as a crutch to help these GPUs stand up against games of the future. Let's see if it needs it yet. The RTX 2060 Max-Q can't really be reviewed on its own. Unlike most GPUs I look at, mobile graphics cards come as part of a package. The package in question here is the base model Razer Blade 2020, powered by an i7-10750H and packing 16 gigs of DDR4 clocked at 2933, running a pair of NVMe SSDs and displaying everything on a rather fine 15-inch 1080 144Hz display. I'm not using this as a laptop today, however. Despite the mobile branding, this laptop is at its best when it's plugged into the mains. Not only because of its abysmal battery life, but also through power limit throttling. As I'm plugging the Razer in, I decided I might as well go full-on desktop replacement. To that end, I've added an external keyboard, mouse, and 1440 144Hz monitor. I'll be using 2560x1440 as my base testing resolution, as well as dropping the scaling by 75% to see how well it does at 1080. There are potentially dozens of variables within God of War that can be adjusted and tested, but I've stuck to 2 resolutions and 2 quality presets for simplicity. For those happy with the original preset, which are the settings closest to the PlayStation 4 original version of the game, the 2060 Max-Q can handle 73 FPS on average at 1080 and 54 FPS at 1440. If you'd prefer something a little extra, the high preset just squeezes over 60 FPS at 1080, but only manages 45 FPS at 1440. Final Fantasy VII, on the other hand, doesn't have a whole lot that can be adjusted. At 1440 high, the game runs at a 70 FPS average, and looks a good deal better than 1080 much of the time. That being said, there are periodic drops into the 30s and even 20s from time to time, and the dynamic resolution scaling that can't be turned off comes into play as a result. This is the kind of game that's worth using an FPS limit on, and you should be able to get a good experience with a 60 FPS cap at either 1080 or 1440 high. The results from the Guardians of the Galaxy benchmark don't mirror the opening stage of the game too well. The benchmark results come up great: 65 FPS at 1440 high, 92 FPS at 1080, and 1440 with DLSS quality manages an impressive 85 FPS on average. The opening level of the game, however, shows substantial drops from this. I haven't played enough of the game to know if it's like this the whole way through, but my test at 1440 Ultra with DLSS saw frames in the mid-40s, dipping even into the 30s. Another unreliable benchmark is Forza Horizon 5. According to the internal benchmark, the 2060 Max-Q should average 54 FPS at 1440 Ultra, and 66 FPS drop down to 1080. Now, these are reasonable frame rates, and I'm not really complaining, but in real gameplay you'll actually see somewhat higher FPS most of the time. 1440 Ultra is good for over 60 FPS, except in the city, during certain races, and in one notorious tunnel. I knew in advance Halo Infinite was tough on GPUs, but I was pretty surprised here. Single-player open-world sections are known to be demanding. 1440 high settings doesn't hit a 40 FPS average, and 1080 falls short of 50. Not what I'd call unacceptable. I think others would agree that 60 FPS in single-player is nice to have, but not a necessity. In multiplayer things get a bit more concerning. Dropping to medium settings, 1440 only manages 48 FPS. You'll probably want to start at 1080 instead, which averages 68. Since I started making this video, Cyberpunk has received its biggest update in a while, the version 1.5 patch. I'd actually already fully tested the game, So I decided to go back and retest and see how the numbers compared to before the patch, doing the same benchmark run as before rather than using the new built-in benchmarking tool. There's a slight benefit post-patch of about 2 to 3 FPS. At 1080 medium, which I'd previously identified as good for nearly 60 FPS on average, minimums are slightly improved, but averages are about the same. I did a quick test with ray tracing enabled and wasn't encouraged. Whatever improvements have been made to the quality of RT hasn't extended to performance. Adding RT to 1080 medium, including lighting, drops FPS from near 60 to less than 16. Adding DLSS performance brings things back up to 39, though I'm not sure the addition of RT is enough to warrant the overall drop in visual quality. DLSS might seem like magic sometimes, but upscaling from 540 to 1080 isn't quite there yet. The canned benchmark in Rainbow Six Extraction is about as far as I've gotten into the game so far, and I can't say I'm overly impressed. 1440 Ultra doesn't look that much better than 1440 High, and considering the extra performance, I'm not inclined to recommend Ultra here. The former fails to average 60 FPS, while the latter hits 70 plus. Things are a little better at 1080 with average FPS of 71 and 89 respectively, but I'm still going to suggest High over Ultra here. The 2060 Max-Q can really flex its CUDA cores in Splitgate, as even the mobile CPU wasn't doing much to hold it back. 1440 Epic settings hits over 150 FPS, meaning if I didn't have a capture card in the middle, I could have used my monitor's full 144Hz refresh rate. At 1080, things are getting out of hand. The slowest map I tested was over 200 FPS, with others averaging 250. Call of Duty Vanguard is a great time on the RTX 2060 Max-Q, regardless of whether you're using a 1080 or 1440 display. 1080 medium was particularly impressive, reaching over 90 FPS on smaller maps and over 80 on larger ones. 1440's no slouch either. The map I tried here wasn't the largest, so you might find it's a little bit lower in bigger and busier games, but I saw almost 80 FPS here, and I can't imagine you'd find it drop below a 60 FPS average very often. This sort of broke my brain a bit, if only because I'm used to this chapter of Fortnite being worse than the last one performance-wise. Last year I tested the 2060 Max-Q at 1080 in my usual competitive and high/epic settings benchmarks, and saw 180 and 94 FPS respectively. Here, 1080 competitive hits 220 FPS, and 1440 is around 180. Pushing up to high with epic view distance sees a very acceptable 100 FPS at 1080, and 1440 averages 69. While I'm not pleased to see this, I'm not 100% surprised. The i7 10750H in my Razer Blade is the limiting factor in Battlefield at certain resolutions and quality settings. While 1440 at medium settings was an excellent experience at just short of 69 frames per second, so was 1080 medium. In fairness, it was about 1 or 2 FPS higher in the games I tried, but GPU usage, which was in the mid to high 90s at 1440, is frequently in the 70s and 80s at 1080. If you have a 2060 Max-Q attached to a better CPU, or one with less restrictive power and thermal management, you could potentially see upwards of 90 FPS here. And finally, another game that doesn't fail to give me some kind of trouble. Call of Duty Warzone is up to its old tricks again, failing to load assets. Believe it or not, this footage is actually at a mix of high and normal settings. Performance-wise, I saw about 60 FPS on average at 1440 and 90 FPS at 1080. If you're lucky enough to have high quality assets appear, you may find you get slightly lower FPS than I did as a result, but fear not. Play Warzone for long enough, and it's sure to break on you sooner or later. As I've either said or alluded to throughout this video, it's not a simple thing to review a laptop GPU. It's not really something I can just say, yes, you should buy a laptop with one of these on board, because you might find the rest of the machine is a steaming pile of shit. The Razer Blade 15 isn't bad, but it does make sacrifices in the name of slimness that come at the expense of performance, thermals, power, and noise. For a mobile workstation that can double up as a desktop replacement, it's not a bad compromise, but if you want something to stand in for a gaming desktop, you should probably look for something chunkier. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.